In our previous lecture, I spoke about the relationship between the Bible and the ancient Near Eastern texts. And we entered into some of the conversations, some of the controversies from the 19th and early 20th centuries about the relationship between myths told in these newly discovered texts, then newly discovered texts, and the material in the Bible with which all educated Westerners were familiar. In today's lecture, we will focus on the texts of the Near East themselves and on polytheistic material, not on biblical material, but on material that describes the gods. Because in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, the religious systems were organized around beliefs in a multiplicity of gods, in pantheons of deities. I will discuss the process by which these religious systems organized the gods. From our vantage point, looking back at history, we can see a system evolving. There were individual gods, and eventually they became organized into a system. Manifestations of nature, such as rivers, the sea, stars, vegetation, wild animals, these became symbols of gods. They were thought often to be inhabited by gods. And then these manifestations were worshipped by these ancient peoples. The purpose of humans, according to many myths in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, was to serve the gods. That's why humans were created. And this wasn't only an abstract idea. In a later lecture, I will read to you from a myth which describes the process, the event at which there's a decision that the gods need help make people. They have work to do. It's like a cheap labor force, create human beings. So our whole purpose here on earth is to serve the gods. And of course, this reverberates, some would say develops into the later idea in the monotheistic religions that the purpose of humanity is to serve the one God. So you can see there's a continuum between these ancient ideas and our modern ideas. Once you have gods, you have them symbolized or personified. You need a system of priesthood to organize the worship and the service of the gods. This too is an administrative question. And in my lecture, I will look at 6 gods on each side. That is 6 gods in the Mesopotamian system, 6 gods in the Egyptian system, and I will make some remarks comparing them. Now, in Egypt, let us begin with Egypt. In the 3rd millennium BC, again, to remind us of our dating system, that is between 3000 and 2000 BC, we have the full flowering of ancient Egypt. In the middle of that period, in approximately 2600 to 2500, we have the building of the pyramids and all that they symbolize. So in this period, we have Egyptian culture and religion organizing itself. And the god who presides over the idea of administration and kingship is the first of the gods I'd like to discuss, Horus, who is symbolized by the falcon. At first, Horus is a regional god in Upper Egypt, and he's identified with the idea of the rule of Upper Egypt. In fact, many of the gods I'm going to speak of in this lecture, both in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, start regional. They start local and they go global. You could think of them like politicians. There might be a good governor or mayor or senator. They'll go for national office. By the way, these gods had proponents, much like political lobbying groups, who pushed them. And we know something about this. They weren't cynical about it. They believed in these gods. They said, my God, the God of my locality, does a very good job. They didn't quite say elect him to be the national god, but they said he should be worshipped on a national level. In fact, later in history, we moved to the idea of worshiping the god on an international level. We go from the local to the national to the international. Horus, the pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, when he became the ruler, was given a Horus name. And this idea of the falcon god is associated with rulership was developed into the idea of the Horus family. So other gods were joined in this pantheon. They include Osiris, Isis, and Set. Osiris was first known in a regional connection also. This is in the other part of Egypt, in the Nile Delta. And when you see him depicted, he's a mummiform character. He's wrapped in the linens of the mummy. Now, in the thinking about kingship in Egypt, the idea was that the pharaoh, when living, is Horus. In death, he's transformed into the god Osiris. And this is a cyclical pattern, because in a sense, the god is reborn with the accession of the new king into Horus again. So we have Horus to Osiris to Horus to Osiris. And this succession of kings and succession of the gods brought a stability to Egyptian thought and to Egyptian society. That is, they had the idea of eternally continuing kingship and godship. Now, in the last 2 or 3 minutes, I tried to succinctly organize this idea, but I'd like to tell you that this is a very modern way of expressing it. What I just said cannot be found in the ancient Egyptian writings. They talk about Horus. They talk about Osiris. They speak about dying and being reborn. But they don't say we are going to achieve stability by having a succession of kings. This is modern theorizing, and something we need to be aware of when we study and read about the ancient Near East. It's the job of scholars today, it's my job, to make sense of this ancient world. In making sense of it, I'm using modern categories of thought that these ancient peoples did not necessarily use. Not that they weren't capable of it. That's something we need to be careful about saying. They had the same capabilities we did. They thought differently about these issues. Often they thought concretely and symbolically. When they thought abstractly, they spoke about it in a concrete way. Osiris functions on this meta level. He functions on the level of the king dies and the king is manifest anew. He also functions as a guide to the dead. When one dies, one is led to and through the underworld by Osiris. And I'd like to read to you from a text from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, really more properly, the Egyptian Books of the Dead. This is a very mysterious title that students of the occult like, but the truth is it's not very mysterious. What it is a collection of prayers and incantations which were used at rituals, and Osiris is continually invoked. The reference in this incantation is to Ani, A-N-I, the scribe for whom this text was prepared. Ye who open the way and lay open the paths to perfected souls in the hall of Osiris, open the way and lay open the paths to the soul of Osiris, the scribe and steward of all the divine offerings, Ani, who is triumphant with you. Here, the ritual practitioner is trying to achieve identification between Ani, the departed scribe, and Osiris the god. May he enter in with a bold heart, and may he come forth in peace from the house of Osiris. May he not be rejected. May he not be turned back. May he enter in as he pleaseth. May he come forth as he desireth, and may he be victorious. May his bidding be done in the house of Osiris. May he walk and may he speak with you. May he have a glorified soul along with you. He hath not been found wanting there, and the balance is rid of his trial. This is a reference to the judgment of the dead. The deceased is judged according to his deeds, and Osiris plays a role in this. So we're going to see Osiris both on the national level and on the personal level. We could also, hearkening back to our theme of multiple approaches to any one myth, we could also use the psychological approach to myths, which I've mentioned a number of times, an approach outlined in the writings of Freud and especially in the writings of Jung, in which they see ancient myths as facilitating human confrontation with ultimate questions. So the question of death is dealt with through the figure of Osiris. Death is inevitable. Death must be faced. There is an afterlife of sorts over which Osiris presides. To be led to it, we need the ritual text. So we could think of the combination of the ritual approach and the psychological approach to make sense in our terms of the god Osiris. Other Egyptian deities associated with Horus and Osiris include Isis, the goddess of kingship. And in Egyptian, her name means throne. She's the throne on which kingship rests. She is both wife and sister to Osiris. And she and Osiris ruled Egypt until challenged by Set. And Horus is the son of Isis and Osiris, but his birth comes about in a very curious fashion, which we'll get to in a moment. She is wife and sister to Osiris. This reminds us that among royalty in Egypt, we on occasion find brother-sister marriage. This was not thought of as incest, as the violation of some taboo. Actually, it was thought of as something sacred. It was not practiced throughout the life of the common people, but it was something that we find actually enjoined upon members of the royalty at certain times, that a brother had to marry a sister. So we find this mirrored also in the life of the gods. Again, the life of the gods is a mirror of the life of royalty. This would speak to the theory of myth as reflecting historical reality, but reflecting it in an oblique fashion, not in a direct way. Let us move to Set, spelled S-E-T or sometimes S-E-T-H. A problem with the S-E-T-H spelling is that the name could be confused with Seth in the Bible, another figure from the ancient Near East. Seth is the child of Adam and Eve, a very different kind of figure. So pronounced Set, he's the god of chaos and disorder. And he is sometimes identified with the Semitic god Baal. He battles with Osiris, he defeats and kills him, and Isis revives Osiris. These myths are really wonderful. What is said in that great movie about Jamaica, The Harder They Come, hero no can die till end of movie, is not true about Egyptian myths. The hero can die, and then the hero can be brought back. The hero is brought back. Osiris is brought back. In fact, he's brought back, and he's able to impregnate his wife, right? Which is a real revival, a real resuscitation. And Horus is the child of this pregnancy. Now, Horus and Set then go to war. Abstracting again, we could think of this as order as battling chaos. And this is a constant theme in ancient Egyptian culture. In expression of ideas of kingship, administration, there are the forces of chaos. They could be seen as in the lower realm. Over them are the forces of order. The forces of order not only have to win, they have to constantly ward off the threat that chaos will erupt again. You could see it as a kind of physical phenomenon, like a volcano or a storm erupting. Order and chaos contending. Horus prevails. Horus becomes king and represents the king. But this doesn't mean that Set isn't lurking there in the background, because that hero also doesn't die. Horus, as I mentioned, becomes identified with the idea of kingship early on in Egyptian history. The unification of the two Egypts, of Upper and Lower Egypt, sees the Horus symbol as the symbol of unification. And when the pharaoh was crowned, Horus was invoked. This tied together divinity and kingship. I'd like to read you a text from a coronation ceremony. This is from the 18th dynasty. That is in the 15th century BC. And we are going to listen to a text read at the coronation of the great pharaoh Amenhotep III of Egypt. Live the Horus, strong bull appearing as justice, he of the two ladies, establishing laws and causing the two lands to be pacified. Horus of gold, mighty of arm when he smites the Asiatics. Notice that Horus is a warrior also. His contendings with Set are a model for the actions of the pharaoh. The pharaoh not only has divine kingship, he can use the attributes of the god and best his enemies. And this specific king and his dynasty were great conquerors. So this is historically relevant. Again, tying together the mythic and the historic. To continue, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nefer Cheperu Ra Wa-en Ra, son of Neb-mat Ra, lord of truth like Ra, son of Ra Amenhotep, Hekwase, ruler of Thebes, given life. Mighty bull, lofty of plumes, favorite of the two goddesses, great in kingship in Karnak, golden hawk, wearer of diadems in the southern Heliopolis, king of Upper and Lower Egypt. So the king is Horus, manifest. The king dies, the king is Osiris. Another text from the coronation speaks of the crown, of the diadem of the crown, and of the fact that the gods, Horus among them, love to look on the pharaoh. Now the pharaoh is both a god and he's looked on by the gods. Hail to thee, thou who art in peace, Lord of joy, crowned form, Lord of the Waweret crown, exalted of plumes, beautiful of diadem, exalted of the white crown. The gods love to look upon thee. The double crown is established upon thy brow. This is the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. The two kingdoms, the two areas are unified. The kingdom that results is symbolized by the fusion of the crowns. So Horus, our symbol of kingship, reigns in a sense throughout 3,000 years of Egyptian history. Osiris, as we saw in the texts of the dead, remains the god of the dead, but curiously, he's also the god of fertility. Now, this might not seem to go together. Shouldn't you have a separate god for fertility? The grain, when placed in the earth, undergoes a sort of death and rebirth. It dies as seed, it's reborn as plant. Osiris symbolizes this death and rebirth. The Nile, the source of all life in Egypt, is thought of as the tears of Isis, that she weeps over her husband. She's mourning for Osiris. So you can see how the gods here are brought into the depiction of the underlying cosmic reality of the natural world. Now, Egypt is particularly fascinating because you would think that the stories I just told you about, this pantheon, would be enough to satisfy the religious imagination. Well, that's a very good story about where we came from, how come we have a king, why is there a river? It's the tears of Isis. Okay, now let's study another culture. No. As Egypt develops, there's layering. We have another set of ideas. We can't say there's any one grand idea, except that there should always be another idea. So we have the god Ra, or Re. We have more than one system, and Ra dominates the whole system, but it's also a system that interpenetrates with the Horus, Isis, Osiris system. Ra is called the Horus of the horizon, and he's seen as one of the primary creator gods. He's identified with the sun, with the disk of the sun, and at one point the idea of Ra is fused with the idea of Horus, and we get the sun with wings, the winged sun disk, which we see in many Egyptian temples. He plays a part in the resurrection of Osiris and his elevation to king of the underworld. And he, Ra, is understood to be involved in the lives of all humans. So if we think of Horus as the god whose interaction is with the kingly realm, Ra has interaction with the human realm, with the more mundane realm, and he judges humans after their death. And in the iconography, Ra is seated, and he's assisted by a goddess, Ma'at, who is symbolized by a feather on the top of her head, a single feather. She's the goddess of truth. Her feather is weighed against the human heart to achieve a balance. Ra is the sun. He emerges as a beetle, that fusion of the sun symbol and the scarab beetle. On the eastern horizon, he moves across the sky to sunset. At night, he's swallowed by the goddess Nut, the great sky goddess, and she delivers him at dawn every morning. So here, too, in the story of Ra, we have a cyclical pattern that is joined with the Horus idea. Let us contrast this very complex and rich pantheon with some Mesopotamian ideas about kingship. Now, I'll remind you that in Egypt, as layered and fascinating as it is, it's a unified culture over 3,000 years of time. In Mesopotamia, we have a succession of cultures. They might last for centuries, they are replaced. We spoke of Mesopotamia as the more open culture, open in the sense that one could invade it, one could take it over. It was open to influence, it could influence others. Egypt was the more closed culture. So what is the picture of the gods in Mesopotamia? Again, as with Egypt, we're looking at a selection. I've chosen 6 gods from each pantheon. I could choose 60, but that would be more than one lecture. So let's look at 6 gods. Gods in Mesopotamia are associated with cities. They, as in Egypt, they could be local, and then they move to a national level. And they also represent natural forces. As in Egypt, we have the storm god Hadad, or Adad in Mesopotamia. The inhabitants of any given city were supposed to serve their god. That was their function. And we will begin with the god Enlil. He was worshipped in Nippur. He's credited with the idea of separation, the separation and organization of the earth. And he rules heaven and earth. We will hear more about him in a subsequent lecture on creation epics. Enki, or Ea, is a god we've met already in a previous lecture. I've called him the organizing god, or the god of administration. Well, that sounds a bit boring, but he has some more interesting jobs. He's also the god of the deep, the god of the ocean. And when gods threaten humanity, he comes to their aid. We read a section of the flood tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In that story, Ea, or Enki, comes to humanity in the form of Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, as he was called by modern scholars, and warns him that there will be a flood. So Ea is a god who can intervene. He's not the god who's removed. He's the god, Ea, or Enki, who brings writing to humanity, the greatest gift of the gods. And with writing comes science, comes medicine, comes astronomy. Now, this is not my abstraction. This is what the Mesopotamians said. They said that writing enabled all of these other crafts of civilization. Anu, who we've heard about in a number of myths, he's a removed god. Sometimes described as the father of Enki and of Enlil. He doesn't interfere in the affairs of humanity, and some scholars have pointed out that Anu is an ancient version of the deist idea. The deist idea in European intellectual history, which posits that there is a divine being, but that divine being is removed from the affairs of humanity. In a colloquial term, it's a God who checked out, a God who's not directly involved. Anu symbolizes that God. He doesn't deign to deal with humanity. Of course, in the Mesopotamian pantheon, there are other gods who will do just that. They're more intimately involved with humans. Now, I've mentioned gods. I need to mention goddesses. There's Ninhursag, the mother of the gods. She's the sister of Enlil. There are many wonderful stories associated with her and with her children. And it's her offspring that show compassion for humanity. So she's the mother god in the sense both that she's an all-encompassing goddess figure, and she's a mother goddess in the sense that her children, so there's a degree of remove, not the goddess herself, but her offspring are able to help people. Of course, there are other offspring who harm people. The Mesopotamians love to explain the human predicament by the actions of these different gods. And this brings us to Inanna, known in Akkadian as Ishtar. Inanna was her Sumerian name. She's associated with the planet Venus and is the goddess of war and of sexual activity. In a way, she's also the goddess of fertility that results from sexual activity. Her sacred animal was the lion, and she's often depicted as standing on a lion. And she, too, was local, and then national, and then international. She's definitely one of those gods and goddesses that achieved international, in the sense of Middle Eastern international fame, because she's worshipped in many other cultures, sometimes under different names. Her city, one of her cities, was Uruk, Warka, also known as Erech or Erech in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Genesis. And you'll recall that Uruk was the city of Gilgamesh, the great hero. In the epic, Ishtar, Inanna, falls in love with Gilgamesh, the divine human figure, and wants him to be her lover. He, Gilgamesh, rejects her. He tells her that he remembers her cruelty to her spouse, Dumuzi or Tammuz. He does not want any part of her love. And because of his rejection of her, the goddess is furious and punishes him in a dire fashion, which we will see when we investigate further the great epic of Gilgamesh. And I need to mention the god Marduk, the son of Enki. He's the god of Babylon, who is featured in the Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian epic, which also has a creation account in it. And his kingship of the younger gods symbolized the great power of Babylon over other cities in Mesopotamia. So we can see that the gods were organized in pantheons in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, and that the differing ideas of society and religion are reflected differently in Egypt and Mesopotamia. In Egypt, we have an identification of divinity with kingship. The pharaoh is the god. In Mesopotamia, we have the kings as appointed by the gods and the goddesses.